Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We're excited to have our COO, Chad Williams, with us, and Chad's going to be presenting on the real connection with Power Apps in Business Central. And as a reminder, we are recording this webinar and all of our webinars, and it will be posted to our on-demand webinar library for you to review again or share with anyone. And if you do have any questions along the way, please feel free to type them into the questions box, and we will get them answered during our Q&A time at the end of our session. So now I'm going to pass it on over to Chad to kick off our presentation.
All right, thank you, Angie, and good morning, everybody. I appreciate everybody taking a little bit of time out of their day, either today or if you catch the recording later on. Again, my name is Chad Williams, and this session, as Angie said, is the real connection with Power Apps in Business Central. So I'm our COO. A little bit about myself. I'm our COO. I have the privilege to get to work with our project teams and our support team. Been with the company for creeping up on 18 years now, and my background is development and software engineering. So I am going to get a little bit technical here because this is about getting the data between the systems, but hopefully also give you some highlights of what you can do, and my contact information is there. So to get started here, as I said, so maybe I should step back just a bit. So if you don't know, last year I did a two-part webinar series on Business Central and Power Apps. This session is meant to pull a little bit of that and to give you some updated information based on what Microsoft has done for us in the past year. And I didn't list it here, but really my overarching goal of doing these webinars and kind of sticking on the Power Apps topic is just to get ideas sparked in your mind. When you can see something, you get a little bit of education on something, it creates ideas, right? And so that really is the overarching goal that I have, is to just help bring some awareness to you folks, so that you can go back and look at what you're doing and go, hey, maybe this is something we can use. This is a neat technology, and I think it has a lot of applications. And so, but for today, the real goal is really to talk about how you get Business Central Online and Power Apps to exchange data, because again, without data, an application is somewhat useless. Even if you're looking at images or something like that, it's still at its raw form data. And so in Business Central, as we know, we have a lot of very good data, a lot of very important data. And if we can't get that in or out to an application like Power Apps or the Power Platform as a whole, it's essentially useless. Or any of these other tools are useless to us. And so, so that's really the goal today. This slide will advance. Oops, sorry about that. Let me read. I think it was stuck. Sorry about that. So on with how we're going to accomplish that. So a little run through the agenda here for today. So first of all, I'm going to give you just a high-level overview of what the connection looks like between Business Central Online and Power Apps. And again, I'm going to speak specifically to Power Apps, but just keep in mind that whether you're talking Power BI, I was going to say Flow, but the new name is just completely escaping me, or the Power Apps, the same technology or underlying technology can be used to connect to any of them. So again, I'm going to focus on Power Apps here today, but keep in mind that could be used throughout the Power Platform. So I'm going to give you an overview of what that connection looks like. I'm going to dive into some of the components of that connection. So first of all, the Business Central APIs and custom APIs. So they have stock APIs and custom APIs. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about something called the Business Central connector for Power Platform. That is the connector that Microsoft has built to specifically connect the Power Platform, or Power Apps in this case, to Business Central. And then I'm going to talk about the Power Platform custom connector. So out of the box, or I should say, Microsoft has worked with multiple vendors and partners to build out of the box connectors to Excel, Power Business Central. I think there's one for Salesforce and a number of others. And so there are many other stock connectors like the Business Central connector, but in the event there isn't a connector for your data source, you can build what's called a Power Platform custom connector. And if you saw part 2 of my webinar series last year, that was a bit more of what I dove into on that as well. And then finally, we're going to talk more specifically here about how to get that data out. And the way to do that is through those Business Central APIs. And so I'm going to talk about how you build a Business Central custom API in something that's called an API page. And we're going to get into some demos. So I've got a few slides to go through here, but really the goal here is to get you in and let you see some of this stuff. All right, so as I said at the beginning of the call in my introduction, I am a developer. So you're going to get a bit of a crude diagram here, but hopefully it helps just paint the picture a little bit better than me just describing it. And so over on the left in our wonderful little blue cloud, we have Business Central Online. Our 2 gray bars with arrows on each end are our Business Central API and our Business Central Custom API. So those, you really can just, for the purposes right now, just think of those as your door in and out of Business Central. I have multiple doors in and out, and that's through custom and stock APIs, and that allows me to get data out of Business Central or into Business Central. Now, those APIs cannot talk directly to Power Apps without going through a bit of a translation layer. And so that's why I've dropped these this orange and green rectangle over the top of the bars to kind of represent that translation layer. So on the top, looking at the BC API or the BC stock API, that utilizes the Business Central connector for Power Platform. So this is that platform, that connector that Microsoft built specifically through Business Central that you can utilize in Power Apps and really need to do nothing else. The limitation with that is it only works with the stock Business Central APIs. Down below on the custom side, because that connector only works with the stock APIs, if I wanted to use a custom API, I had to use a Power Platform custom connector, which came along with additional layer, additional work, additional time, and a little bit more complexity. Not impossible. My demo that I did last year was built all on top of that, and it works just fine. It just took a little bit more time. And just to kind of share in perspective, I would say that there was a learning curve, at least for me, to get over. The APIs themselves were fairly straightforward. Working with the Business Central connector was fairly straightforward. But in the terms of time, I would say easily, 3/4 of my time was spent on that green box, if you look at the overall demo and work that I did to build some of these things. And so that's something we have to deal with. And then, obviously on the far right here, we have my Power App. So that's kind of how the data gets from Business Central Online to Power Apps. This, just one quick disclaimer, this isn't the only way. There is another way to work through what's now called Microsoft Dataverse, which was the Common Data Service. There are ways to work that way as well, but for the scope of this webinar, I am not going to dive into that. So let's dive into each piece a little bit more deeper. So let's start off with the Business Central stock APIs. These are simple. This is a simple API interface to connect to Business Central. So no different than you would have with many other applications where you have an API. This is that door, as I said earlier, to get data in or out of Business Central. In the past, whether we're talking about Nav or Navision years ago, one of the great things about the product has always been the ability to move data in and out. Whether it was just a simple text form or a text file many years ago, and now to have something as sophisticated as these APIs that are built using a standard interface that you would see in many other applications. Probably one of the most widely used API standard out there now. Built on REST web service technology. If If you're familiar with REST, REST web services, the way you would interact with these API endpoints is no different. You would issue your post, your get, your different commands that you were used to. There's no difference. So if you've worked with this technology, there's nothing to learn here other than the Business Central data and where stuff is. If you're on the online platform, which again is really where my focus is for this webinar, it's ready to go. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to set anything up. You don't have to buy anything extra. It's there, it's configured, it's ready to go. If anything, you may have to set up a username for somebody to authenticate. If you're on premise, just to speak to that briefly, there is some configuration, some administration stuff that needs to be set up, access outside your four walls, those types of things. So there's a little bit more work, a little bit more legwork to get that up, but you can utilize those as well. If you're going to utilize them within your domain, certainly much easier. And as you know, or may know, when you're talking about going outside of your domain, you've got security and networking issues to consider, and so it's a little bit more complicated, but certainly possible. When they first released these APIs, I believe they started with 44 standard APIs. And so what does that mean? What are these standard? So just think of it as a data set. So each individual API is just another data set or just another table, if you will, in Nav. So these standard APIs, when they came out, you had customers, you had vendors, you had items, you had general ledger entries or whatever it might be, standard tables. Now you may think of the application, and certainly if you're a developer, there are thousands of tables within the database, and tens of thousands of possible data set combinations you might want to share, I suppose, outside of the system. And so 44 is pretty limited. At last count, I think I counted last week, counted about 50 some, quick count. So as I have previously said, I think there will be more to come. They have added a few more, and I suspect they will continue, Microsoft will continue to do that. And then finally, as I said earlier, and as the diagram illustrated, the way you tap into these stock APIs to get to the Power data to the Power Platform or to Power Apps is utilizing this Business Central connector. So you're probably already thinking, that's wonderful, but 44 tables, or even if you're telling me it's 50 some tables now, isn't going to get the job done. I'm probably going to need data from a different table. Every database I've ever been in has got custom data. And so you probably have custom fields that are added to stock tables through table extensions. You've likely got custom tables that you've added. And so odds are pretty good you're going to need to get to that data at some point. And that's where these custom APIs come in. So the stock APIs, if nothing else, it's to somewhat from Microsoft, you wonder if it's some way just to give you a teaser of like, hey, here, look, this is what you can do. And by the way, it's not really that hard to create custom ones. We're not going to create every possible combination, but here is a Swiss Army knife that'll let you do everything you could possibly want to do. And so that's really what these are. They're built on the same standard, their same REST web service API. In terms of what they actually are within Nav or within Business Central, they're just objects. So if you're familiar with Business Central development, or maybe even if you're not, you may know there are pages, there are tables, there are queries, there are code units. These are the different objects within the database or within the environment that make up the application. So pages are the object you interact with probably the most, especially directly. So when you open the customer card, that is a page of a type card. When you open the customer list, that is a page of type list. And so what Microsoft did is they just created another type of page called API. They also created another type of query called API. And so you have two options when you're going to create a custom API. You can use a page or a query and set its type to API. The benefit of using the page API type is that it's going to give you all of your CRUD operations. So create, read, update, and delete. So it's going to allow you to do everything you need to do with that data set. And it will also allow you, if you want, to restrict that. So if you only want to read and update, you can remove, create, and delete. On the query side, it's just read only. So for my demo here, I'm going to focus on the page side, but the query is going to be just as straightforward to create. It does require a little bit of code, but don't panic. It is fairly simple. If you have developers on staff, odds are pretty good they could figure this out with a little bit of help. The biggest hurdle for them is probably going to be, where is the data? And that's where either your end users may be able to help, or you can work through your partner. If you don't have anybody that can write code, you may have to work with your partner to do this. It's not terribly complicated, but you do have to write some code, and I'll show you that later. And then this is, again, the Power Platform or Power Apps cannot connect directly to the custom API. It goes through a custom connector. That was the green box again on the diagram. And as I said, it's just another layer of complexity that gets added to what you're doing. Well, that was the case up until this Wave 1 release of 2021. So we have an update. So Microsoft has now made the stock Business Central connector for Power Platform. It is now capable of accessing both your stock APIs and your custom APIs. So this is a big deal. If you've gone through the previous webinars, or if you have started to work with this and you've gone through some of these steps, you've probably seen, yeah, there's a little bit of work there in that green box again, if you will, in building that custom connector. Again, it's not rocket science, but it's just another layer of complexity. It's just a little bit more effort. It's another thing you have to kind of understand. And so you don't have to worry about that anymore. And so this came out with this Wave 1 release. It is independent of the actual version or release that you're running in your BC SaaS tenant. So if your tenant hasn't been updated yet, this new connector is sitting out there and it's ready to use, because it's completely independent of your environment. And so my tenant, I believe my demo tenant that I'm working with, that I'll show you in a bit, hasn't actually been updated yet, but I can utilize this new connector and tie right into my custom APIs. So it removes that need of that Power Platform custom connector, the complexity that goes with it, the extra layer that goes with it, the maintenance of that goes with it. And the other thing that it does is it allows you to do what you, so in Power Apps, you have different ways to build applications. And I'm going to show you this a little later, but you can build an app. You point it based on the data you want to use. So you point it to a data source, it'll analyze that data source and say, hey, this isn't rocket science. This is a simple list of data you've given me. Odds are pretty good you're going to want to look at it and interact with it in a standard format. And so I'm going to create an app for you without writing any code, just through a wizard, that's going to give you a start of an app that, without doing anything further, you can run and it will work. And I could, for example, I could pull down an item list, I can select an item, I could edit an item, and I could save it back to Business Central without doing anything else. And if you've seen my previous webinars, I've showed that, and I will show it to you a little bit, a little briefer here today. But what this does is, so that worked with those standard connectors, with the Business Central connector for Power Platform. It didn't work with the custom connectors. Not that you couldn't, it didn't work directly. It's not that you couldn't still utilize some of those benefits, but this is more seamless. So now I can go and select my data and let that wizard build that app from scratch. Now, is that going to cover every scenario that you want to do? No, but it's going to give you a really quick start for most of the types of things you want to do. And it's also going to give you a good reference. So it's always, there's people have different ways to learn, but one way to learn is to actually have an example to go and look at and go, okay, well, I need to do the same thing that's happening here. Well, let me look at what's happening and see if I can replicate that. And so at the end of the day, it makes it a heck of a lot easier and a lot faster. And so we want to look at it, but just before we do that, let's go back to our fancy diagram here that I created and just show what this means, what this update means to what I had shared earlier and what was our reality a month ago. So we have our same diagram here. And really the change here is that this green box goes away. Now, you can still do this. If you have a compelling reason to still build a custom connector to interact, you can do it. Or if your application is already utilizing it and you don't want to change it, it will still work. But if you're building a new one, you don't have to worry about this green box anymore. And really what the diagram turns into is this. And so what we have is now both the stock APIs and the custom APIs are now accessible through this Business Central connector for Power Platform. And we're going to show it again for Power Apps. I'm trying to keep Power Platform in there because I want you to understand that this works with Power BI and the other Power Platform technologies. I'm going to show you Power Apps. But now I can connect through the one thing. I don't have to worry about the green box anymore. And so let's just take a quick look at that here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just escape out of my slideshow and bounce over to Internet Explorer. And with any luck, I am still logged into everything. And so, I'm in my Power App. So just quick overview, I've got my own tenant here set up. I have Business Central in it. We'll come back to that later. And then I have a Power App subscription in here. And so I'm just working within this kind of self-contained environment. And so I'm on the Power Apps home screen. I'm not going to go through all of the aspects of this. I've done that in previous webinars. So I really want to, again, just focus on the data and getting things moved around. So what I want to show you is this concept of building an app from data. So I'm going to start with it and then to be able to show you what the Power or Business Central data connector does and how I can see all of the API types. So just focusing at the top of this list here, you see I got SharePoint, Excel, etc. So these are these out of the box, if you will, connectors built for the Power Platform that you can utilize that already know how to connect to these technologies. So Business Central is not listed here, but it is part of that toolbox of connectors, if you will. And so when I go into create a new app from data, the first thing it wants me to do is tell me what the data is. So this here is already a connection that I've created to my Business Central environment within my tenant. All I had to give it is a username and a password. I don't have to mess around with URLs or formatting them. If you've worked with, when Power BI came out early on and Microsoft released a Power BI report pack, it was a pain to get it connected to your environment. This, if you're on Business Central SaaS online already, username, password, it will find everything it needs to find. And so before I dive into that though, I just want to show what the new connections look like. And so you can see here, these are these different connectors. So when I'm talking about a Business Central connector for Power Platform, that is specifically this thing right here. And so I can select these different connection types based on the data source that I'm working with and get that in there. So you can see I've got Business Central, I've got Business Central on premise, and I've even got Dynamics NAV. And these will get much more complicated because you have to give more information into them. And then as I scroll down, you'll just get a quick glimpse of the different connectors that are already out there. If your connector's not in the list here, that's where the Power Platform custom connectors come in. Let me go back here to the connections. And so I want to just select this existing connection that I've got. So again, this is connecting to this Business Central environment. What it's doing right now is it's looking at it and going, okay, I know you have Business Central on your license, you have it in your tenant. I am looking at your environment and seeing, or your tenant, and seeing what environments you have in that tenant. And then in each environment, what companies do I see? So if I have, for example, a production environment and a test environment or a sandbox environment, it's going to look at each of those and find the companies in them. And so what it's returned here is it actually found 4 different environments. The first name before the dash is the environment name. So I've got a production environment, sandbox, and then these other sandboxes. So I've got 4 unique environments. Within each environment, I have 2 companies. In this case, each environment has the exact same 2 companies with the exact same 2 names. And so that's why you see production duplicated twice, 1 for each company. So I am working in this production environment, Kronos USA company. And I just want to show you here the actual APIs. So when I talk about stock APIs, custom APIs, these are those APIs. So previously, a month ago, before this release came out, I would have only seen the stock APIs. And for the most part, those are the ones here that have the v2.0 at the end. So accounts, if I scroll down, you'll see customers. If I go down further, you should see items here. So those were the stock APIs. I could not see any of the other custom APIs in my environment. However, now I can. And so I'm just going to scroll down. I've got two that I'm going to pick on and show you for the rest of the session here. So I have something that I've called SFDC operation entities. Well, that happens to stand for shop floor data collection operation entities. And then I've got one called shop floor data collection line entities. So these are the two data sets that I need to work, well, to build the app, the Power App that I want to show you, and then to allow me to get the data that I need out of Business Central, and then to send the right data back in to have the right effect within Business Central. So I'm not going to jump any further here yet in Power Apps. I will come back to the screen a bit later, but I just wanted to show you in terms of the connectors and what this actually looked like from a data connection standpoint. So I'm going to go back to my slide here for just, I think just one more slide to talk about the actual API pages, because that's what actually gets it done. And then we'll dive back over into Power Apps and show you some code. So we'll talk quickly here about the actual API pages. So as far as the page, it's just a data set. It's a way to expose a data set outside of the system. So if you think about a customer card, as I said earlier, or maybe more specifically, a customer list within Business Central, its purpose is to expose data to the user outside of the system. And so in the same sense, that's the way these API pages are used. They're used to create a data set. So if I have a customer list, it doesn't necessarily have every field within the customer table. It will have certain fields from the customer table, and it might have other fields from other related tables that I've surfaced onto that page. But ultimately what's there is what you can see. And if you copied that out into Excel, you kind of have a data set. And so the same kind of applies with an API page. So you're building a page type of API, but when you see the code, it really looks the same as a list or repeater type page. The page is going to have its own unique properties. So every page has a page type, whether that's card, list, document, and there are others. This will have a page type of API. When you set the page type to API, all of these other properties now become relevant. So I have API publisher, group, and API version. Those are really just informational to tell you, to allow you to put your name on it, maybe to put a name on the group or modification that you've created, and then to version it. The entity name and entity set names, those are just the name of the data set. And the difference between the two is the one is the singular name and the entity set name is the plural name. So if we're talking about customer is the entity name, customers plural is the entity set name. And then I've got caption to go with that to help with localization or translation. There are some naming conventions that Microsoft recommends around these because these properties are ultimately used to help build a URL or an endpoint. In what I'm going to show you today, we don't really have to worry about it. If you go back and watch part 2 that I did last year, we talked a little bit more of that because we had to create that custom connector. So I cared a lot more about what that looked like. But so it's still important how you name these because they will ultimately be URLs. So as you can imagine, you can't have unique characters and so forth. So they do recommend camel case, which is essentially if you've squeeze your two words together, the first word is lowercase, second word uppercase. And so that's for attributes or field names, tables, and then as well for your publisher, your group, your entity name, and your entity set name. The caption, as you suspect, is just a caption, so there's a little bit more freedom over that. Alphanumerics, A to Z, upper, lower, and then 0 through 9, no special characters, as I said. The API version is a little bit unique. That will have a pattern of V and then number dot number. So v1.0, v1.1, v2.0, however you want to version it, it's completely up to you. Or if you're in a testing mode, you can use the phrase just beta in there. Anything else than that, and it's going to throw a fit. There are a couple other, there's actually one other key property that you must set, and it's called Odata Key Fields. And so this data set that you share out will need to have, each record will need its own unique identifier. And so you may say, well, if I have a customer list, I have a customer number. Well, what if your data set doesn't include the customer number for some reason? And the other issue is that part of the REST API standard, it has to be a certain data type, and that is a data type of GUID, or a globally unique ID. That's those really long alphanumeric sequences you've probably seen. There's a couple dashes in between, 20, what is it, 26, somewhere around there. I forget how many digits long it is nowadays. Or it's always been the same, I don't remember today. But it needs to be unique that way. And so what Microsoft has actually done is they've added a system field to every single table that's called system ID. It is a type GUID, and it is, and you can use this for this property. So as you know, every table, or well, if you're a developer, and you may know, you have, every table has a unique key on it, and in many cases it's a number field or a code field is the data type in nav. So for item, number, customer number, et cetera. But there's still this GUID now behind the scenes. And this is also for custom tables. So as you add a custom table, it will also add a system ID behind the scenes to the table that you can utilize. I don't know when they added it to the custom tables. I think that came along when I originally built this 2 years ago, and I created a custom table. I added a GUID key field to it so I could use for this. And as I got back into this, found that was no longer necessary. And then finally, the last note here is just these page types can't be extended. It kind of makes sense in my mind when you think about it. Not a real big deal. So just meaning that if you needed to change an API, you just create it. You can't extend upon a different one. So really not a big deal. I don't know. Maybe Microsoft will change that, but I honestly don't think it's that big of a deal. And I think I would personally rather just have my page be independent and not extended upon and therefore dependent on a different page, because again, they're not terribly complicated. And so with that, let's really just get out of PowerPoint and get back into some real stuff here. So quick overview just in terms of this application. So I said earlier that I've got this shop floor data collection thing. So for those folks that haven't heard my sessions last year, what I did is, so 10 plus years ago, we had a couple of customers that had a need for a very simple shop floor data collection application. So they wanted to be able to basically post output on release production orders on those operation steps, be able to post back time and potentially finished quantity or scrap quantity back into the system. So at the time, I built it out of C# and .NET. It was a terribly large and complex project at the time. And so I wanted to see, hey, this Power App stuff, can I build something like that? And maybe not get it exact, but in relatively quick fashion, can I build something that essentially does the same? And so that's what I did. And so that's the example I'm going to show you here. But before I do that, I've got, again, I kind of gave you the lay of the land, but I've got a stock Kronos environment here. If you've worked with the Kronos data before, you will know they have very little production data, if none. Actually, I think it is none in the system. So I had to go through and create some production bombs with their routings. And so I've only got one release production order here. It's for a very fancily named item called parent item. For simplicity, it has a routing, and so it's sitting here in a release state. And so I'm going to actually work with this. So what I want to be able to do in my app is be able to show the user a list of the release production orders that are open that they can post output to. And so the first step of it is going to be able to get this data out. The second step then is going to be able to send data back into the system that basically says, hey, here's my output quantity and my time associated with this release production order that I want you to post into the output journal. And so in my example or my actual app that I built many years ago, there was a approval process in between there. So I've just kind of simplified all of this just for the sake of doing a demo. And so what it will do is just bring it back into the output journal, and then it'll be sitting here waiting for someone to post it. So let's go to Power Apps now. I'm gonna close out of there. I'm gonna jump back over to Power Apps. So I'm back on my main Power Apps app screen, and I've got an application down here that I'm just going to run. So this is the app that I've already built that has the data. And then, so I'm gonna show you the app, and then I'm gonna go back and talk through how the data goes back and forth. And so as I showed you a minute ago, I only had one release production order out there. It has one routing step. And so that 101005 is my release production order number for my parent item number 1000, and for the assembly department operation 010. And so what I want to be able to do is now just simply select this. It's going to default in my order number, item number, and operation. So I know what I'm actually posting time or quantity to, and then I can simply enter in some values here. So I'm going to do a runtime of 60. We'll output 110, and then let's say we had to scrap, and then we had to scrap 10 of those. And so this data is here. I'm just going to hit my checkbox. This will send it back to Business Central. So I'm going to do that. It's going to refresh there. And then, so I'm going to go back to Business Central. I'll go to my output journal. And so now I've got my line in here for 101005. If I scroll over, I should be able to see my output quantity of 110, runtime of 60, and then my scrap quantity of 10. So a very simple example, but I think relatively practical. And so there's really two steps involved to getting this done, as I said earlier. First of all, I have to get those release production orders out of the system and to the display in the app. And then I need to be able to then send back the inputted data from the application to Business Central. So now, for the developers on the phone, we're going to finally get into some Visual Studio Code and look at what this looks like here. So I'm in VS Code. I'm already in my extension. I've already built the extension. I've published it, and it is in my tenant. I'm not going to go into how to write AL code, how to write extensions. We've done a lot of webinars on that, and we've also have a, if you haven't seen it, we do have a couple hour, I forget now how many hours exactly, development workshop that we do now in getting started with AL. I think we've done it 2 or 3 times now. I know we've got one coming up. But if you are interested in learning more about AL development and getting some basics on building an extension, especially if you're going to want to connect some custom data, I highly recommend it. Or you can always reach out to your partner, and they can help you out as well. And if you work with us, we'd love to help you do it. And so let's dive into these. So I've really only got 3 files here. Each of these files contains one object. And so I'm just going to kind of work through these in reverse order. So this first one is called shop SFDC operation entity. So if you recall back to that list when I went to my environment of all the APIs, I had those 2 APIs shown there. This is one of those. So this is just a page. It has an ID and it has a name, just like any other page in the system. It has some properties, just like any object in the system, and then it has really the meat of the object, if you will, down here. So I'm going to skip over some of this API stuff for a second and just show you again that at the heart, this is still just a table. My tooltips will stop popping up. And so as every page, or nearly every page in the environment, has a source that it's coming from. And so it has a source table. It happens to be that this data that I'm actually looking for is contained within the prod order routing line table. So that's where I see my released production order routing lines. So I can pull that operation step out of. Now, as I said, I only want released data, so whether you know this or not, but there is one for all production orders, whether it's released or firm planned or any of the other statuses. They, outside of actually finished and posted, they sit in the same table, and so I have to filter just on release. So I can also filter this data set just as I would with any other page. And I can also control whether it can be edited. And so, as I said earlier, I have all my CRUD operations available: create, read, update, and delete. But if I want to limit the control, I can make the whole thing uneditable. If I want to allow insert only or delete only, or not delete only, I don't know why you would do that, or restrict delete, I have the other properties that I can set just like I would on any other page. So let's bounce back up to the top here, and then we'll work down. So the page, again, every page has a type. In this case, it's a type API that then enables, really brings into effect some other fields. So again, I have my API publisher, the API group, and version. The API publisher, I just set to Innovia Consulting. I mean, you really think of who's the publisher of this API. So if you're building it in-house, you might give it your own name. You can give it a name in terms of a group, in terms of, think of it as a group or a set of modifications or APIs that you might want to categorize. I have, this one is just called Summit because I had named it that way a while back when I built a demo for Summit. And then I have my entity name and set name. And so it's the singular and plural form of my names. And you'll see I've prefixed them with a lowercase to stick with that kind of Camelback naming convention Microsoft recommended. So I've got entity and entities, and we saw the SFDC operation entities back in the list. And then my captions. And so, so I'm just gonna flip over there again just to show you that again. So that's how that name relates. So those, again, those names are important. Again, here you're gonna just reference them to find it in the list. But if you were going to interact with this endpoint outside of using this connector, you would need to note those names because that's would dictate how the URL endpoint is formatted. So going back to VS Code and just finishing out this object. So as I talked about earlier on the slide, we have Odata Key Fields. Again, that is the field within the table that we will use to mark each field or each record in this data set as unique. So as I said earlier, we have this new built-in field that is added to every table called System ID, and that is of type GUID, and so I'm just going to use that. If I go down, if you've ever built a regular list type page, you will notice this is built pretty much the same. So I've got all of my fields here. So on the right here of each of these fields, the right parameter is the actual value that the field is coming from. So I've got my production order number, item number. I do have description. I'm not using that. I've got the operation and some other information. And then the first part of this is the actual name or the attribute name that will be given. So when I look at the data set from outside, that's the name of the field. And so this is, again, where Microsoft recommends that camel case character. You can't have special characters in here or it will complain. Okay, so that's my operation side. So this will let me get the data out of the system. Now I need to be able to send the data back in. So if I work my way up, that is my SFDC line entity. So you'll see a lot of the same information here. So I've got my API page type set. I've left my publisher group and version the same because these are all together. I've given my entity set and my entity names. So entity, SFDC line entity and entities, and my captions. And then I've got a source table of something called SFDC line, which is not a stock table. So what I did for this is I'm going to bounce over to this other file. Is I actually created a custom table just to hold the information that I'm going to pass back and forth, or actually pass back to Business Central in this case. So this is going to have the key data that will tie the input to the order into the operation. So I've got my order number, my item number, my operation, and then the actual fields that the user will enter: quantity, runtime, and scrap quantity. And so what I'm doing here, not to go into a lot of the detail, but I'm essentially, as a record is inserted into this table, I move that record over to the output journal. The code for it is actually down here. I'm not going to go through that in detail. You'll see some lovely hard coding here for the sake of demo purposes. But I'm essentially tricking the system, so it actually never inserts a record per se into this table. If you ever look at this table, it will never have anything in it. It's just using it to get the data over to the system and to trigger an event to create the, which is technically an output item journal line, is the table that sits behind the output journal. So again, finally, if I go back to the entity, this is referencing that source table. Again, I've specified my Odata key fields to the system ID of that table so that it can uniquely mark each record. All right, let's see here. So let's go, so we've kind of seen that. I'll go back into Power Apps. Again, so that last entity, or that last file or object that I showed you is this one here. And so that is the second component of this application to get the data back. So now let's go back into Power Apps, and instead of running that app, I'm just going to edit it, and we'll take a look at what we've got here. So this should load fairly quickly, and so I'm going to show you first how the data is connected to bring in those released production orders, or those, more specifically, those released operation steps or routing steps. And then how the data is sent back. And so this is the design or edit mode of Power Apps. If you haven't seen that before or seen previous webinars, it's really neat because, as you can see here, it's almost like it's showing me the finished app, but this app isn't technically running. This is still in design mode. So I can see the data, I can see how it looks, and so it's really a powerful platform to build upon. And so what I've got here is, so on this form, so this is that form that first came up when I ran the app. I can see my operation step here. And so I'm going to select this control here. I just clicked. And so there's actually the main control on this page, or this form, this screen, is something called a browse gallery. And so browse gallery is just Microsoft's term for a listing, more or less. And so it happens to be a little bit more fancy listing because it can show you information in different formats, but it is the main control that will wire up that data. And so over on the right here, you can see I've got a data source, and you can kind of see the name. But if you actually look right here to the center, up in the formula bar, you'll see that name, and it's the exact same name that we saw back in that data set list, or that API list. So not the fanciest of names, but it works. But it's got the whole thing in there along with my publisher, group, and version number. So that's essentially connect up to there. You can see very little code. The fields here, if I hit edit, I can see the field names behind it and how they're set. So there's a body, subtitles, and then a title, main title. That's the order number. So I could change these if I want. I could remove them. They're all right here for me. So I manually built this app just for reference, and I'll show you, I'll finish out and show you what it looks like when I create it through the wizard. And then finally here, if I go over to my other screen, so here's my data entry screen where the user will put that in. So it's showing me just default data here, so I actually have something to look at and see what it might look like in design mode. And then I have my inputs here. So this on it also has a kind of a parent control to it, and this is called an edit form. Again, up at the top, I can see here, this is wired up to my line entities. And then if I go to my fields, I can see all of the different fields. I can remove them. If I didn't want to report scrap, I could just remove that from the bottom of the list. And then finally, you know, when I hit to close this, it'll go and update that data back. So those are really the main components. So now what I want to show you because you're still probably thinking, well, there seems like there's some magic here. How'd you wire these things up? And so I'm going to go back here just to kind of close as I close out here and actually build this app again from data, because I want to show you just what the platform can do by just pointing it to a data set. So I'm going to use the operation entities because, again, as I said, this line entities is just a means to pass data back and forth, and there's nothing in the table. So I'm going to just select this. I'm going to hit connect, and the little magic window pops up, and there's stuff going on. Don't pay attention to the guy behind the screen or the curtain, and something's happening. And so it's building this application. So it's looking at my data. It's going, okay, you've got a simple listing of data. And so it applies it to a standard template and says, all right, you probably want to be able to view these records, in which, in this case, if you recall, I had one production order here. And so it's going to just build this app for me and say, okay, you probably want to see this data. So I'm not going to do anything further here, and I'm just going to run this application. So I've got a list here. I could search it if I want. I can drill in to see details. And so it's not going to build a perfect app. It's going to build you a very good start. And so it went and just said, okay, well, I'm going to show you all the fields, all the data that you gave me, or I'm going to show some of them if there were many. So, here's that big long GUID that nobody would ever actually show on a page because it doesn't mean anything to anybody. So obviously you would remove that, but I can see my order, item number, I can see the description, etc. And so by looking at that data set, it went and said, okay, I'm going to build you an app that has a listing. I'm going to let you drill into the detail of each one. And in a different case, it would also have the ability to edit this. And so if you recall, on this screen or on that page, I did not allow it to be editable because I don't want the user to change this data in this application. So now I could have just allowed it and prevented it through the application, but I know I'm never going to want that data edited. And so to protect the system and to protect somebody from using that API to do something I wouldn't maybe want them to do, I'm going to just not allow it. Now, just so you don't get super panicked on what they could do, when you run this code, it's still going to go back through, it's going to hit the validation logic. So if you've worked with Nav for many years and you worked with SQL in the past and you know how dangerous it can be to update data through SQL, it's not quite the same. The business logic and so forth is still going to fire through this. So you're still somewhat protected. So it's unlikely somebody would just inadvertently change an order number here, at least no different than they potentially might through the application. So yeah, that's really the application, just to kind of give you an overview of how the data can move. And then finally here, just to show you real quickly how easy it is to build that data. And again, the big change here is this new functionality that Microsoft, or new capability that Microsoft added to be able to connect, connect to those custom APIs. Because before, you couldn't build a data app like this from using the wizard. You could kind of do it indirectly or copy things around. And now you can create your custom API. You can use that Business Central connector for Power Platform, plug it in here, and then you can utilize these things. And again, this isn't going to create every app for you, but as you can imagine, different scenarios, it's going to give you a great start. And certainly for more simpler things that you want to do, it's going to probably give you something almost out of the box with very little time, very little money, that you can use and start being productive with right away. And so with a few minutes left here, I'm going to bounce back to the slide deck and just wrap us up here. So I've got some suggested resources here. I've updated this from previous webinars with new material that I have found and more useful material. If you've seen some of my earlier sessions, you will know that 2 years ago or so, when I started out on this, there was very little information out there, very poor documentation, both out just in the community and from Microsoft. It was kind of gave you half the story, but nothing really connected all the dots. That has changed. So getting started with Power Apps, that has been a resource that's been out there for a while. That is good. It's continued to be built up. The second one here, developing a custom API, is new, and it is a very good walkthrough. So if you are wanting to dive into this further and you want to give it a crack at on your own, I highly recommend going through this. It's a very good tutorial. They're going to have you build 2 custom APIs related to cars and car brands. So it's a very simple example. And it's also going to showcase some of the new things that they added to the APIs that I didn't talk about in this webinar, but I'll just mention briefly. They've added the ability to kind of nest child records within a parent. So if I had sales orders and sales lines, previously I have to build 2 data sets for that, or I have to marry them, kind of merge them into one. But if I wanted to essentially show, all my sales orders, and then for each order that actually had lines, then show a separate sub data set, they have added that kind of ability. So if you're used to working with REST APIs, you're going to say, well, of course it does that. That's how they all work. Well, we now have that ability to build that into our custom APIs, and they'll show you that in there, as well as the use of enums and some other things that they've added. Custom connectors for Power Apps. Again, they're not completely irrelevant because of what Microsoft has added. They are maybe somewhat irrelevant for folks who just want to keep it simple and get going. But if you do have more complex situations, or again, if you have a data source that there isn't a connector out there for, you can still go this custom connector route, assuming they have a similar REST API. And then finally here, I didn't get into it today at all, but I've talked about it a lot in my previous webinars. Microsoft is doing a lot with AI. They keep acquiring companies. They acquired the voice recognition company. I can't think of it. Was it last week or the week before? And so I've done some things where I've extended that app that I showed you before to be, okay, a list is wonderful, that's boring, but show me something cool. Take a picture of something and have it recognized what's in the picture. Be able to pull some text out of a document type of things. And so I've shown that in the past. And so I just want to continue to speak to that, to the AI stuff. Microsoft is just continuing to make investments in that. And I don't think they're making any hint that they're going to slow down on that. And I think it's going to be able to take what's a pretty cool platform, a very easy, Microsoft has said citizen developers, enable citizen developers. So people that haven't had extensive development background, give them the ability to come in and do these things. But then to really take it to the next level, this AI stuff is definitely gonna be the path for that. And so with that, Angie, do we have any questions?
Thank you, Chad. Yes, a few questions have come in. What about on-premise? We need API for on-premise for this to be useful for us.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, it is available for the on-premise. There is going to be some more setup work that needs to be done. That's probably a whole nother topic to kind of get into. I have shown just the online SaaS capability, which is all built in. It's very easy, but these are available if you are running on-premise and you're on the newer versions. I mean, obviously, if you're running an old version of NAV 2013, you're not going to have this. But if you're on the newer versions, I don't know if it came out in 2018, but for sure, if you're on any of the Business Central versions, it is there for you. And then, as you would have with anything within your 4 walls, when you need it to be accessible to the outside world, you've got some work to do with your IT team to get to that within your domain. So it is possible, but there are some additional steps and setup administration type things that need to be done to make sure it's secure.
Okay, thank you. And then can you use lookup lists for fields in the app?
So I'm just trying to think of the question. So can you look up from fields to lists? Yes, it's not going to, so if you're asking if it can look up directly to Business Central, well, I suppose that probably is technically some way possible. But essentially, if you're going to have a lookup to something, quick answer is probably you're going to just surface that data to the app so that within the app you have another lookup screen that you build to go to it. I know there's way to hyperlink and do things to kick over to Business Central, but I don't know if that's going to create the experience you're probably looking for. So you're probably going to rebuild any lookup list you want to do. You're going to just expose that data and then build your build that within the Power App.
Okay, thank you. If anybody else has any other questions, please feel free to type them into the questions box. Or if you would like to contact your account manager here at Inovia Consulting or Chad for further discussion, we'd be happy to have those discussions with you. So thank you, Chad, for presenting. It was a very good, informative webinar.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Again, Angie's maybe going to speak to this slide already, but certainly check out our upcoming events. I alluded to some other webinars that I've done. Those recordings are out there. You can always reach out if you can't find them. And then certainly if you want to learn more, as Angie said, certainly reach out to your account manager. Or you can reach out to myself directly, and my contact information is there. So thank you, everybody, for the time this morning. I really appreciate it. And hopefully, again, the goal here is just to spark some interest to get folks get folks moving into this Power Apps world. And so there's a lot more to learn, a lot more to talk about, and we'd be happy to help you along your path to Power Apps. So with that, thank you. And Angie, I'll hand it back to you then.
All right, thank you, Chad. And as Chad said, thank you for everyone for attending. And if you're watching on demand, thank you for taking the time out to watch this. We do have more webinars coming up. Next Wednesday afternoon, the 28th, we have Lakesis, who will be presenting on assessing your cyber profile. And on May 4th, can you believe it's May already? We have our support team presenting on May the 4th be with you, all things techie. So check out our website for more of our upcoming events, and that's inovia.com/events. We do have a podcast going on. If you haven't heard of it, it's called the Inovia Conversation. And we just want to encourage you to listen to the selection that our hosts, Steve Waltz and Jeff Progolski, have provided to us. You can find out about all the different podcast platforms to listen to on our podcast page, and that's inovia.com/podcast. So check out the selection and subscribe so you'll be notified when those new episodes air. And as Chad mentioned, we do have training workshops available. We do have a new round that is on our website. So check out that selection and select the specific training workshop that will fit your role. And you can find that at inovia.com/workshops. All right, well, we thank you again for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you on another Inovia webinar. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.